character development is going from considering these guys nothing special or nothing worthwhile back in 2017, which if I'd had a bigger follower base back then, I probably would have been doxxed for saying that, to now going on to giving them a worst to best and honestly considering them one of the best bands around right now, period. Pretty mad to think that I ever had that opinion at all, but I think at the time, with how Pitchfork was peddling a lot of indie bands that had a similar indie folk sound, maybe sort of a bit of a sad singer-songwriter vibe, I ended up just branching them all together and grouping them all together into this one pile of inessential indie slop that just didn't appeal to me at all. But if there's anything that has changed my mind, it's how consistently bloody good Big Thief have been, and a lot of those other acts that kind of want to be Big Thief or kind of want to mimic Adrienne Lenker's style just never will truly reach the levels that she does. And I actually think Big Thief overall might have had a bigger influence on indie singer-songwriter music than a lot of people may give them credit for. So that is why I have ultimately decided these guys are absolutely friggin' brilliant, and it's about time I give these guys a worst to best. Now, I've got to blame you guys for how much torture I've been put through these past few days, because you voted for this on Twitter or X or whatever the friggin' hell you want to call it nowadays. I still think it's called Twitter. It's better called Twitter. Just call it that. But I did do a little poll. I did ask you guys which albums you want to see me rank, Perfume Genius or Big Thief. You all voted for Big Thief, of course. That's why we're here. But it's been so hard. Their discography is ridiculously hard to rank. I didn't realise how difficult this would be. The quality gap between their albums is so small, it's so tiny, and there is literally no bad album out of the 5 albums they've put out either. It's been so hard doing this. Usually with worst bests that I've done like 20 at this point, by the way. You should click the playlist and watch through all of them, because I've done many artists that you should watch and get stuck into, because they're really fun to do and they're really fun to watch. I hope you enjoy them as much as I do. Click the playlist. But usually most artists have like maybe even 2 or 3 albums that I'm like, this is okay, it's fine, it's at the worst, it's at the bottom, and then you kind of go on from there and move on to all the really good stuff. That's how it's been for all of the worst to best that I've done. Most artists have that. Yeah, maybe not as many as 3, maybe not 2, but usually at least 1. Okay, I mean, I'm thinking like Tyler, the Creator, or Jessie Ware. They've got at least those few albums that I wasn't that keen on, and then I get to the really good stuff by the end. But freaking Big Thief decide to be different, all right? They just want to be quirky. They don't really want to fit in with the crowd. They just decided to put out really good albums where there isn't anything bad, and it makes it even friggin' harder to rank. So I have found a way to finally rank these 5 albums. Of course, I am not including Adrienne's solo stuff, which when you factor in all the albums that she's put out in the past like 6, 7, 8 years with 2 separate artists, like her solo and Big Thief, and the quality has been so friggin' high, it's ridiculous, to be honest with you. But we are only talking about Big Thief's studio albums, and I have finally found a way to rank them. So without further ado, do remember that there isn't a bad album here. The worst isn't really the worst. We're just going to rank them from my least favourite to my favourite, starting with You Don't Even Know Why When You Cry. I was happy to rank this one as my least favourite Big Thief album, despite the fact that it's still very bloody good, and it is really silly to call any of their albums the weakest, but you have to do one, okay? And UFOF is an album that, to be fair, did come in a year where they dropped 2 albums, so it's like, of course the quality was probably going to be compromised somewhere, and yet it wasn't really compromised that much either anyway. But for me, this one is still their weakest work to date. I still think they've got some incredible songs on it. You've got friggin' the title track where she puts out some really wonderful lyrics where she says, "You'll disappear, the map turns blue," which I think is really clever because it's like the idea of, a kind of weather map turning blue to represent rain. It's a really clever way to say that when you're sad or when someone leaves, you're going to get very upset and it's going to get rainy without actually saying that cliche thing. I just think Adrian just comes out with some really, really crazy stuff sometimes. And there's probably another way you can interpret that lyric, but for me personally, that was how I interpreted it. You've got Friggin' Orange, which is super, super comforting. You've got the track Cattails, which for me still ranks up there as one of their best songs. So even on what I consider their worst album, I would still say it features a song that I would probably put in my top 5 overall Big Thief songs. That's the quality we're kind of talking here, guys. Absolutely adore this track. You've got the really traditional sort of folk rock sound on this one. You kind of got that like stomp and holler feel to it as well, which given the renaissance of that sound in the mainstream at the moment, I wouldn't be surprised if Big Thief end up getting a viral hit. I mean, I don't know if they're under the umbrella of the UMG that has basically tore apart the entire TikTok algorithms, playlist, etc., etc. I don't know if Big Thief would fall under that because they've literally took like 80% of the entire music off that whole app, and it's incredible how much of a widespread they have. But if they don't, and this is still possible for Big Thief to make it onto there, I wouldn't be surprised if a song like this or any other of their songs end up getting viral because they just do have that kind of sound to them. But yeah, I mean, when I'm splitting hairs, I guess I'm going to have to pick out a few tracks that I'm not really that keen on, like Terminal Paradise, which isn't really that high impact. And Jenny is a song that I really appreciate because it definitely sounds like they're trying to push the sound a little bit more and do something totally different. But for me, I just don't think it lands very well. It's very droney, it's very heavy-handed with how it sounds. But for me personally, just never been the biggest fan of that song. So yeah, like I say, splitting hairs here, but I had to find a way to find a weakest album, and there are just a few tracks that maybe sound a little derivative of the indie folk sound, whereas their other albums I think have a bit more of a distinctness to them. Speaking of the two albums that they dropped in one year, the other album that came out in 2019 is at number 4. Now I do want to point out that I've not done this on purpose just because the two albums came out in one year or anything like that. It has quite literally just landed like this. This has just been the way my list has ended up ordering. And going back to all their albums over the past few days in preparation for this video, this one has actually dropped ever so slightly. I would have thought this was at least top 3, but it turns out that opinions can change, and this has ended up ranking at number 4 for me. But even still, again, the quality is ridiculously high. We've got Forgotten Eyes, which has a really earnest feel to the chorus, where she says about how everyone deserves and needs protection. I really love that line. I really love that motif that she comes out with. A really, really beautiful track. We've also got Shoulders, which honestly sounds like it came from like a horror movie or something like that, like with some of the lyrics about how, the blood that came from somebody that murdered somebody is in me. I don't know if this is just a story that they came up with, but it honestly sounds like something in a horror film where you realize that you're like the son of some kind of serial killer or something. Really, really interesting narrative. And I do think generally across this album, they do come through with some darker, more daunting material that just feels like everything is so depressing and everything is looming over you in a totally different way to their other albums. Cut My Hair being a great example of that. Just feels really personal and feels really, really heavy with the emotions that Adrian is demonstrating on that track. But again, all really, really good stuff. I think the pinnacle of this album, though, the peak of this album, which I think everyone would agree with, is the track Not, which was on my year-end list for that year. It's still a fantastic 2019 song. Just the voice breaks, the cracks, and the emotion that she comes through with is so powerful on this track. I actually love how that comes through in ways that you don't often necessarily find with like traditional great singers. I think sometimes there's a bit of a maybe I don't know the word, but maybe it's like frowned upon for singers to just let that emotion crack through in that way, because everyone just wants to be pristine and perfect and hit every note, whereas Adrian isn't afraid to let loose, and it just really adds that raw emotion to the songs that you wouldn't otherwise get. But that distorted guitar playing through the outro is fantastic as well. Yeah, a very, very good album. Just unfortunate that they have 3 albums that I think are better. At number 3, we've got Capacity, and now we're at the point where every Worst to Best video I do, there's that one album that ends up growing on me. It happened for friggin' Death Grips, it happened for friggin' Tyler the Creator. Every single time I do a Worst to Best, there's just that one that actually I end up going back to and thinking, oh yeah, this is a bit better than I realised. Literally all of them, but this is the one for me. And Capacity is, yeah, a very, very strong album. Has ended up surpassing Two Hands, which is pretty interesting. But I actually really like the instrumentation diversity on this album. I think they actually pull out some really cool sounds with the guitar playing, and honestly there's a bit of like a post-rock vibe to some of these songs, which I don't think they're necessarily pulling specifically from that genre for every single track. I just think that kind of approach to some of the song structures really reminds me of something that would come from the 90s, from that era. You've got the really incredible songs such as Haley, which is an absolute stunner, and also the track that comes after it as well, that nice little 2p there. Some really lovely tracks there. But I do really like, I've got the lyrics written down here, where she says on this song, if you ever want to come back, you know my arms are always open. That is just such a lovely lyric. Like, that is so lovely to say and so beautifully worded that I always just get a nice little tingle whenever I hear her say that, because there's just such a softness to her style, and the writing and the instrumentation that matches it that I absolutely love. You've also got Shark Smile as well. I think this is a really cool track. So it has a bit more of like a Heartland rock feel to it, which is something a bit different from what you tend to get from their songs. So yeah, Capacity really did end up changing my view on this one, because this was the album at the time back in 2017 where I just kind of wrote off the band, and I was like, yeah, I don't really get what's appealing about these guys. But ultimately that has changed a lot, and yeah, that is my number 3. At number 2 now, we have their debut album Masterpiece, which at this point in the video always gives away what number 1 is going to be, but I of course still have to pour my love for Masterpiece into this video. I can't just, you know, bypass it and skip straight to number 1. That would be absolutely silly, because honestly, my number 1 and number 2 could be a toss-up on any given day, if I'm being honest with you. That's how tightly close these albums are, and how tightly close, again, their discography is, because there really isn't that much of a gap between any of these albums, to be honest. It's insane. But I have to talk about Masterpiece being my second favourite album. Just an incredibly wonderful album that just has some really nice lyrics on this one, that I just feel like has like this like understanding feeling, where Adrienne just has such a powerful emotional intelligence to her, where she just kind of understands feelings and emotions on such a grand level across all of these tracks. But there are just some essential songs on here, man, like Interstate. I mean, at this point, this feels like it should be part of every single indie rock classic playlist. It's not even that old of a song when you think about it, really. But god damn, it should be slotting into any indie rock essentials, because it is just that good. And it really does sound like it came from like an era where indie rock was really at its booming peak. But you've got some amazing lyrics across this album, which I'm going to read out as well. On tracks like Paul, where she talks about, she kind of demonstrates so many different ways in which she can like pour her love into somebody, like where she says, I was your hurricane rider, and the woman you call, which is a really interesting lyric. And I also want to mention Real Love, which is beautifully written as well, where she says, real love makes your lungs go black, real love is a heart attack, which I think anyone that's experienced love will understand exactly what that means. But even as someone, for me personally, that isn't currently in like a relationship or anything like that, hearing those lyrics kind of scares me, because it's like, oh my god, like that powerful feeling that just makes you kind of collapse within yourself, that love can do, just makes me scared to feel that, you know, ever again, because it is really powerful, it is really scary. And yeah, but it is just depicted so brilliantly on this track. There's some really slacker rock energy coming through on this album as well, which makes the album kind of feel like it's in its own space compared to their other ones, because I don't really think they kind of revisit this sound in the same way. You know, kind of like 90s pavement feel that some of these tracks have. It doesn't really pop up again on any of their other albums, so it just makes this album feel extra unique. But also, I do want to mention tracks like Velvet Ring, which it feels like a precursor to some of the stuff they end up doing in that indie folk realm later on. Which is a really lovely track. So yeah, for me, this is second, very close to being the number one. But as at this point, you know what number one's going to be. Just before we reveal that though, I do want to mention and shout out my Patreon just for you guys to check out, because there is a tier on my Patreon where you can request worst to bests that you can support me over on. So if you do have any interest in that, and you will get a say basically on any future worst to bests. So there you go. And also, if you want to go on any of the other tiers, you can support me over on there as well. The cheaper tiers like the £1 or $1 per month, which gets you on the Discord. There's lots of perks, guys. You should consider supporting me over on there. But of course, now we need to get on with the video and talk about Big Thief's best album, which is, of course, in my opinion, Dragon New Warm Mountain, I Believe in You, which is the most Mountain Goats album title you will ever hear, is my number one Big Thief album, to the surprise of probably very few people, because I think at this point it ranks as a lot of people's number one Big Thief album, which at the time I did probably underrate a little bit on my channel because I didn't give it the most glowing review, but I still put it on my year-end list. But I think based on where I feel about this album now, it should have ranked a lot higher than it did on that list. But even still, an album that is this long probably is open to criticism and open to people really saying it's got too many tracks, it's got too much filler, that kind of thing. But honestly, this is a gold standard for where albums this long should be. When you listen to an album and you feel like it's running too long, it's got too many tracks, it needs to chop it down, well, you're probably not listening to Big Thief, because they absolutely nailed the length of this album. It really is just absolutely flooded with amazing song after amazing song, and quite a diverse range of tracks as well. You've got a few tracks on here like Spud Infinity that really sounds like some kind of honky-tonky farm music, which is something that we've never really heard them do before. But also there's a few tracks on this album that really embrace that country sound in a way that we haven't really heard them do in the past. But bloody hell do they nail it. It sounds really, really fun and goofy, and a little bit quirky as well. But Jesus Christ, I could talk about so many tracks. Certainty, For You, I Am the Child Believing, which is a really wonderful lyric. I feel like that sort of feeling like a child, just kind of having belief in absolutely everything, even if you shouldn't be so naive. And that feeling kind of coming back as an adult and just pouring it into somebody else, I think is absolutely stunning. You've got Little Things, which is just an incredible song. Again, ranking probably in the top 5 tracks that Big Thief have ever done. And there's probably a few tracks on this album that could rank in the top 5. Simulation Swarm, guys. Simulation Swarm. Let me tell you right now, Simulation Swarm is one of the most splendidly delightful songs I have ever let grace my ears. What is it about this song that sounds so warm and so cozy and so inviting in a way that I just have never heard an indie folk song ever do? Like, seriously, it is just a stunning song that really, really does not lesser the impact, where no matter how often I hear it, it is just sensational. You've got Blue Lightning, which I love again, which I mentioned about another track earlier on, where she kind of finds different ways to kind of say something, and she keeps going, I want to be blah 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 blah, I want to be blah 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 blah, and that's a really beautiful moment on the track as well. Stunning closing track. And yeah, you've just got all of these pockets of wonderful tracks scattered throughout this 80-minute runtime. And yeah, maybe sure you could cut a couple of tracks because they sound similar to other ones, yada yada yada, but I don't even know if I would, because No Reason, Red Moon, they're just all spectacular and just all produced so well. They're performed beautifully, and yeah, it is just one of the coziest sounding albums of this genre, I think, in the history of the genre, to be honest with you. It is that good, and it ranks, to me, as their best ever album. And that is it from me. That is the discography ranking of Big Thief's 5 albums from worst to best. Let me know your thoughts on my ranking. If you agree with me, if you disagree with me, just hit me up in the comments and tell me what your order would be. Of course, as well, if you haven't heard any of these albums, then obviously now is a good time to check them out based on this video, and then come back to the video and let me know afterwards. But that is it from me. Hopefully you've enjoyed this one. It's been a while since I did a worst to best, but I do really enjoy doing these, so hopefully you guys enjoy them as much as I do. Please support me over on Patreon. Please at least subscribe and like the video and comment to get this video circulating in the algorithm. Share it as well with a friend if you're a big fan of Big Thief, or if you know anybody that likes them, share it around. And yeah, hopefully you're sticking around for more content in the future. Have a good day and goodbye.